If you've ever wanted to build a knife, but you're worried you don't have the specialized equipment or the knowledge to do it, what if I told you you could do it with tools you may already have? On episode 200 of Knife AQ today, we're going to show you how to turn this knife blank into this finished knife using nothing but common household tools. Hey everyone, David C. Anderson here, coming at you from the KnifeCenter, and welcome to a very special episode number 200 of Knife AQ, where I answer all your questions, sharp or dull. And for all the folks who have left questions in the comment section below these videos over these last several years, 200 episodes of doing this series, thank you so much. Keep them coming. But today we're going to answer a question that's been asked on and off over this last period of time while we've been making this series is, how do I get into the knife making hobby? How do I start? What do you do? Well, I would recommend starting somewhat the way I started, quite honestly. And that's using something like this. This is a Condor Woodlaw knife blank. I may have started out with old hickory kitchen knives. I knocked the handles off and did handle projects on them. That's where you want to start though. A fixed blade like this that is already hardened and already ground, so you don't have to mess with any of that right off the bat. We're going to be making handles for this knife today. Now, the nice thing about starting with a design like the Woodlaw is it's a very simple and straightforward shape. It's going to be easier to learn for your first try because honestly, the last thing you want to do is overcomplicate things. And as mentioned, best of all, you can do it with simple hand tools that you may already have. Now, to show you how we turned that blank into this finished knife right here, we're visiting the shop of our good friend Dan Eastland of Dogwood Custom Knives. He let us kind of take over his shop for a day, and we made some knives. We built some knives and filmed it. Before we go to Dan, however, let me tell you what you will need to do this project. In terms of raw materials, of course, you need the knife blank. As mentioned, we're going to need some handle material. Wood is going to be the easiest handle material to work with for beginners, and we just use simple hardware store oak, 1/4 inch thick for the handle scales right here. You'll also need some pins for the handles. These are 3/32 inch holes, and we just used wooden dowel in that diameter for these. If you want to use metal or a brass or something like that, you could do that too. But again, starting off, wood is very easy to work with. Now, in terms of tools, we're going to need a drill, and that's actually the only power tool we're going to use today, and a drill block to keep your holes straight if possible. We'll also need a handsaw for cutting our wooden pieces. We'll need files to shape the wood. If all you've got is a half round with a flat side, that's good enough. We'll need a flat sanding block. A cheap table vise is going to make life a lot more easy. Doesn't have to be anything fancy or expensive. And you're going to need 3 to 4 clamps, either the screw type or spring-loaded are fine. And last but not least, the only kind of specialized piece of tooling that we're going to need, or non-common anyway, is a perfectly flat surface. The cheapest way to get something you can ensure is perfectly level is to get some samples or offcuts from places that do stone countertops, for example, and we'll tell you why you're going to need that in a little bit. As far as consumables, we're going to need sandpaper, working our way up from 80 grit up to 220 grit. Some masking or painter's tape, some CA glue or super glue. We're also going to need some epoxy. And you don't have to overthink this. It could be a hardware store 5-minute epoxy or 30-minute epoxy. There's more professional grade knife making epoxies you can get, but starting out, these other grades are going to be just fine. For cleanup, we're going to need some toothpicks. That'll make more sense later. Some acetone and some food grade or medical grade alcohol. And then don't forget safety gear. We're going to want a dust mask, either a disposable N95, or if you've already got it, a full face respirator, and some disposable gloves like latex, nitrile, that sort of thing. With these things at your disposal, you're going to be able to build a legitimate knife that you can be proud of. But the first thing we need to do on this journey is we got to make everything flat. So for that, off to Dan.
First thing we're going to do is a little bit of prep work. Talked about the stone earlier on. We're going to use that to make, among other things, our handle material flat, because if it's two pieces are completely flat, they'll glue together better. So we're going to take a little piece of 80 grit sandpaper. We're going to make sure the back is clean. We're going to make sure the stone is clean. If you feel any little bits of debris on the stone, that's going to make a high spot, and that's going to keep you from making stuff flat. So if you need to, you can use a scraper run across. Later on, if you need to change the sandpaper out, I use a little bit of acetone. You can peel the sandpaper off. There's going to be a little bit of glue left. Just use the acetone to clean the glue off. Light coat of contact adhesive. You just want the sandpaper to stay still on the stone. If you put too much on when you go to change the paper, it's a pain. One of the reasons you're going to use a sanding block is when you're trying to make things flat, you need a flat surface behind your sandpaper. Great way to make sure your sanding block is flat, no matter what it's made out of, is you lay it flat on your sandpaper that's on your flat stone, and you give it a couple of turns. If you see everything looks nice and flat, then everything is flat. If you see places where it's a different color, that's a low spot. Just keep working. Another technique is to take some pencil, put some marks. Here you'll see there's some faint marks left. That means those spots are a little bit low. Now you know it's flat. You're going to use the same technique when we flatten our knife scales in just a minute. While we're working on our blade blank, any damage that happens to the blade, we're going to have to fix later. So a great way to protect that blade is with your masking tape. Remember to be careful. These blade blanks have come sharpened, so there's an edge on them. So be very careful while you're handling them. And you want the tape just forward of the first pinhole. We're going to scuff up this blade back here. It's going to help the epoxy hold better. But we want to stop at that first pinhole to make sure we don't accidentally get scratches down here on the blade. So we want to make sure the tang is flat. You're going to wrap the sandpaper once around the sanding block. You don't want anything between this first layer of sandpaper and the sanding block because you'll just undone all the work you did to make something hard and flat. If you're not at your wife's dining room table and you've got a thin workbench, you can clamp the blade down, or you can hold the blade edge facing away from you. And you're using very little pressure for this, and you're just going to go in small circles. You're not trying to take away any steel. You just want, basically, you're taking the shine out. You want to make sure you got plenty of scratches. And if you see a really obvious low spot, as long as it's not right along the edges, that's fine. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to rough cut your scales to the approximate size you need. This is just going to make them easier to work with. So what you'll do is you're going to lay your blade blank. You want the blank to be a little bit past the end of the scale here. And even through the tape, you can see where the edge starts. You're just going to make a mark. Then you're going to do the same thing at the other end. Remember to keep your fingers, matter of fact, every body part away from the sharp moving edges. Double check, make sure they're going to be long enough. And now we talked about two surfaces are going to glue up together better if they're flat. These seem flat, but as you can see, they're not. So we're going to keep working. I like to work in a circular motion. It helps the epoxy to not have long, straight scratches. Just keep working in a circular motion till all the pencil lines are gone.
So you may be asking how essential this flattening process is and if you can skip it or not. I would say skip it at your own peril. If you do, you're going to introduce some issues later that are going to be harder to overcome. It's going to be harder to drill both sides of the handle straight and even. You could even create some voids in the finished knife that you're not going to be able to cover up. So you're better off spending the time now getting these pieces as flat as you possibly can. That's going to make life a whole lot easier as we go to the next steps. Speaking of which, it's time to drill the handle scales and test fit all the pieces together.
Now, you're going to want to mark the side that has not been sanded or the outside. Don't ask me how I know to do this. You've got your insides and your outside marked. You're going to put the two insides. The inside is the part that's going to go against the tang, which is the metal part of the handle of the knife. You're going to put those together. You're going to line up one edge. And what I like to do is on the edges, I'll make an X. And that way, if anything happens to these flats, you've got two arrows that are pointing towards the inside, and they work as two markers down the road. If you need to realign the scales, you just realign the X's. I'll do 2 on one side and 1 on the other, and later on that'll help you keep everything indexed. Next, we're going to use just a little dab of super glue. I like to use a spring clamp to keep everything held together. And what we're basically doing is we're tack welding these two scales together, and it's just 2 little dabs. Once we've drilled the first hole, if these become misaligned, then they'll never fit back together again. So this is just one more extra step to make sure that everything stays aligned. Later on, when we need to break them apart, it's really simple. I'll show you. But all you got to do is smack it on something hard, and those little glue spots crack, and it's like they were never there.
So what Dan is doing here is he's cutting the dowel that we're going to be using for our handle pins. And we're actually going to be using these pieces as the holes are drilled in the next step. So don't skip this part. Make sure to cut your pieces a little bit oversized, so longer than your 2 sets of handle scales and tang stacked up together. We're going to file them down to size after the handles are attached. You want that extra bit of wiggle room before you actually get to that part. Now you'll want to lay your knife blank onto your handle scale set. Make sure you've got coverage for the whole handle. Make sure the front end of your handle scales extend at least a little bit past the ricasso, or even just past where the plunge grind starts. The plunge grind, if you don't know, is the actual primary grind that leads down to the sharpened edge. That's where that grind starts. Now that front section of the handle is going to be another thing that we cut to shape after we drill the handle scales. Once you're happy with the fit, tape the knife blank to the handle blocks together in place, and we'll go to the drill.
This is one of the most dangerous things a knife maker does, is drilling these pinholes. And the reason for that is if the drill bit binds up when you're drilling the hole, the blade's going to want to swing around, and it's not pretty. So you'll notice a couple of things. One, I'm going to clamp it down into this vise. And even though it's clamped down in the vise, you'll notice I'm going to be standing back from it. And that is because just in case the horrible happens and this thing comes loose, I've got plenty of space between me and it. I'm going to clamp this down in the vise, and notice I've got the edge facing away from me. We're going to use our guide block. There's a series of different size holes. We're going to find the appropriate size hole for the bit. Close counts on this. I mean, you don't want to try to use the 1/4 inch hole for a 3/32, but if you've got a 3/16 and you're a little over, a little under, that's fine. I like to go through the block and then get the bit lined up in the hole, and I'll slide the block down, hold it firm, and I'll give it a little tilt, make sure it's seated. I'll drill the first hole, and then I'm going to pin it. Then I'll drill the next hole, and I'll pin it. And the reason we're doing that is if the tape slips a little bit while we're drilling these holes, and it moves between one hole and the next, then your pinholes won't line up and you're going to have to start all over. If for some reason your pins are just not going in, they're a little bit too big, you can take a dowel, you can chuck it up in your drill, and then use a little bit of your sandpaper and move the sandpaper front to back, and it'll sand those dowels down to proper fit.
So now that everything is drilled and fitting together, we're going to trace the outline of the blank onto the handle scales and just trim stuff away.
So we'll cut away the tape. We're going to trace out the outline of this knife. The really golden rule on this is going to be, do not go across the line. The closer you get to the line, the easier it's going to be down the road. But if you cross the line, you've ruined it and you're going to have to start all over. So judge accordingly. Now, while we're here marking things, just be aware of where the ricasso is. If you've got a bunch of material past the ricasso, you're going to want to cut that down so that you're pretty close to it. We know what we're doing, so we're right on the edge, so we're not going to have any material to trim away.
So now that we've kind of cut down to shape the front of the handle there, we're actually going to completely finish that part of the handle now before we attach the handles to the tang of the blade. Because if you don't do this now, you're going to have a bear of a time doing it later without scratching your blade up. So now's the time to do it.
So we're going to draw out what contour we want, what shape we want for the front of the blade. We're going to shape and sand this all the way to the point of where it's going to be finished before we glue up. Depending on the size and dimensions of your vise, you may need to push one of the pins out so that the scales will fit. If you do, it's okay, but you have to have at least 2 pins in, preferably the 2 furthest apart. Configure it however you have to make it work. You can also clamp down to a table, but this is where a vise is going to make your life way easier. This is where we're going to start with our files. I'm going to start with a fairly coarse one. If that's the option, go for it. If all you have is the medium half round, this still works. But you're going to start with the flat side. And right now, we're just truing these 2 edges up. And you can see where the color has changed. This is where the file is biting. Over here, where it's still dark, the file hasn't cut there yet. So again, those are low spots. Next, you'll notice that we got a little bit of a warp here. That's fine. That little crookedness, that's going to work in our favor in a minute. But what we're going to do now is we're going to follow this contour, but we're also going to put a slight slope coming from the center out. Notice that if you push towards the edge, you're going to get some tear out. So if you're working on the left side, you want to go left to right or outside to inside. When you switch over, outside to inside, and that's just going to cut down on that tearing. From time to time, you want to stop, and you're looking for symmetry. We clearly have a little more to take off of this side, but when we get it right, it's just going to be a nice soft curve, and these 2 edges will be parallel to each other. If you wanted to, we could have just left this flat and square, because as you can tell, there's a little bit of effort that goes into this curve. Part of it is aesthetics. Just having that nice curve is pleasing to the eye. Also, if you have a sheath, if you want to use a deep sheath, having that curve right there, that little slant, will make it easier for the knife to go in and out of the sheath, or more specifically in the sheath. Once you've got everything looking pretty symmetrical, you've got the curve you want. It doesn't have to be perfect. We're roughing it in at this point. We're now going to move to sandpaper. Since this is a wooden handle, we'll probably stop at 400-600 grit. We're going to start at 80, work up to maybe 120, 180, 220, 400. I went ahead and cut my sandpaper into little 1/8 strips. This just makes it easier to manage. And I'll even tear those little 1/8 strips in half. And there's 2 ways to do this. You wrap it around your sanding block. Now you want to make sure that there's only 1 layer of sandpaper on the side of your sanding block that's down. Some people will keep wrapping the sandpaper around it, and then you lose the advantage of having something hard and flat behind your sandpaper. As you're sanding, you want to check, make sure you're keeping your symmetry and your shape. When the sandpaper starts to wear out, you just slide it down, wrap it around. Once you have your shape and your symmetry where you want it, now it's really just a matter of polishing. So we're going to go up to the next grit in sandpaper. For this one, it's going to be 120. We're still taking off a fair amount of wood, so be aware. At this point, I start using my thumbs. That's going to give you a little softer backing so the sandpaper will ride the contours, and you're more likely to just polish the shape you have rather than change the shape. Pinching the sandpaper, and I'll just roll in. And this is how I control the tension, is to make it more tense, to make it flatter, I roll towards my thumbs. To make it less tense, to make it more of a curve, I just roll away, and that takes the tension out of the sandpaper. One of the other advantages to backing the sandpaper with your fingers is as you're running along this curve, you'll feel if there's a rough spot, if there's a corner, and if you do, you just work that spot a little extra and then go back. Now, there's 2 other techniques you can use. I typically do them with higher grits. It's a shoe shine method, and that is where you're going to hold the sandpaper way out on the edges, and you lay it down, and you work it back and forth. It's really efficient, but I feel like I get a little less control and a lot less feedback on the shape. And in the end, you're going to want all your scratches going lengthwise. So if you're using this technique, you're going to have to come back and go this way. I'll use that at the really high grits for polishing, especially on G10 and micarta. But for wood, I prefer to back with my fingers so I get more feedback. Now we just move up the progression. We went 80, 120. Now we're going to go 180. From here on out, we're just smoothing and polishing, and that just becomes a matter of preference. How shiny and smooth do you want it? But the one thing you do want to do before you go much further is you want to check and make sure that the front of your handle doesn't go past your ricasso. Apart from an aesthetics thing, it can interfere with sharpening down the road. So before we start moving into the polishing, just make sure that the handle is far enough back.
Now, once your fronts are done, now we're ready to epoxy the handles to the tang. It's getting real serious now. So a couple pro tips from Dan, actually. Parchment paper makes a great work surface because of how non-stick it is. And popsicle sticks make a great implement for stirring and spreading epoxy. First thing to do, though, is to clean the handles and any of the pieces you're going to be gluing up to make sure there's no dust, debris, or even the oils from your hands. We don't want those getting in the way and interfering with the epoxy fit, and that's where the alcohol comes in. All you need is a quick wipe down. It dries nice and quickly, so it's not going to stay wet by the time you're ready to epoxy things up. Now, Dan prefers food-grade alcohol. The reason being, it tends to be cleaner, actually, than some of the isopropyl alcohol you can get off a drugstore shelf. Those can actually leave a little bit of residue, believe it or not. Now, before you actually mix your epoxy, get everything laid out, plan your moves, and make sure you peel back any tape that may be sitting underneath the handle scales. We don't want that getting into the way. Mix your epoxy according to the manufacturer directions and then spread it evenly on one side. As far as the pinholes, make sure to swirl with a toothpick in there to keep an even coat on the inside. Then insert the dowels. Then put your knife blank onto the dowels, making sure your orientation with the scales is still correct. That's important. Then spread the epoxy on the other scale, place it onto the pins, and you can clamp everything together. Now make sure you start from one end of the handle and work your way up. If you clamp the ends first and then the middle, you can actually trap some pressure in the center, and that can have negative impacts on the integrity of your bond. The key thing also is not to over clamp and squeeze all of the epoxy out. You want it snug, but not tight, if that makes sense. Getting just a little bit of epoxy to ooze out of the side is where you're going to want to be. Now, a little bit is going to ooze out the front of the handle here, and you'll want to clean that up now before it sets using your toothpick and some paper towel. I didn't mention that in consumables earlier. Sorry about that. Just a little bit of acetone, and I mean just barely damp, is going to do the trick. If you use too much, it can actually get underneath the scales, and it's going to dissolve the epoxy and ruin your bond there. So be careful. Make sure to clean any smears on the blade as well at this time. So hopefully everything sets up real nicely and your epoxy cures and everything looks good. Now it's time to grab your file and the sandpaper, and we get to start the most exciting step.
Now that the epoxy has cured, we're ready to do what is kind of my favorite part, but we're going to start shaping the handle. For this one, we're going to go with just a nice simple, we're going to radius the curves, clean up the edges a little bit, and it's going to be a really functional blade. We'll go to the files. The first thing we want to do is clean everything up and make it relatively straight and square, and then we'll start putting some shape into it. I'm just going to start with a coarse flat file. If you're using the half round files, just use the flat side. And as you start, you're going to just try to ride over and hit all the high spots, and you'll work your way down and everything will come flush. If you bought a set of files and it came with this kind of messed up wire brush looking thing, it's called a comb. Wood is relatively soft, and after a while it'll feel like your file is getting dull, and really it's just getting clogged with wood. You can take your comb and you just push it through the little flights, cuts, grooves in your file, and it'll start cutting better again. Once you have metal exposed all the way around, we'll switch up to the sandpaper. And this is an opportunity for you to decide how much time you want to put into this. If you really want it to look its best and you want to spend the extra time, then we're going to sand all the way along the spine. That's going to give everything a nice uniform sheen and texture. If you just want a functional blade and you're not worried about the little details, do the same thing, and then on the butt, and then start shaping. I've got a few minutes, so I'm going to go ahead and clean all this up. To do that, you're going to clamp the blade in the vise so that the spine is a little bit higher than the jaws of your vise. You want flat, even pressure, just firm. You're not leaning into it. If you lean into it, the vise is going to pop, or the knife is going to pop out of the vise. Long, smooth motions. You're going to work that until the whole spine has a nice, even sheen to it. If you get one little stubborn spot, a lot of people's first instinct is to just work that spot really hard. If you do that, you're going to get a low spot right there where you already had a problem. And that's why it's important that if you're sanding any part of it, you're sanding all of it. You want to use the whole thing. So you'll notice I've been working the spine, and then when I move to the drop point, I'll work from here to the break, and then from the tip to the break, and then just as I'm finished, I'll run between the two, and that just helps keep that crisp line. If you keep working all the way along, you're just going to round that line off. It won't hurt anything, but aesthetically, I like to kind of keep that line crisp. So we're going to finish up at 220. You will find that as you're sanding, especially the spine, up towards the top, the tape may work loose, and you're going to get some debris down in there. It's not a huge deal, but if you stop, clean it off, and reapply the tape, it cuts down on the chances of scratching the blade. All right, I'm going to hit the spine right here with a little 400, and I'm going to call it good. I'm going to fast forward through it just to save y'all some time. But down here on the belly, you're going to do the exact same thing we did up here. Cut the wood, if you want to go that route, as close to the belly of the tang as you can. Use your files, smooth it out. When you go to sand in here, just be careful. If you run past the ricasso and hit the edge, you're going to dull the blade. One of the easiest things to do is you clamp your jaws, or clamp the knife in the jaws right so they're at the edge of the ricasso. And if you're using your sanding block, that'll keep you from going past it. Next step is I'm going to put the blade in flat. And I like to clean this up before I get started. You can go back to your stone with your sandpaper on it and sand these down. Since they're wooden pins or dowels, they go pretty quickly. Or you can just sit here with your file. Now, there's a couple of ways we can start shaping this thing. The most tempting way is to just get at it, because all we're going to do is round these corners off. But I have found if you take a few minutes and lay it out, you're going to wind up with a faster, easier product. Depending on the size of your hands, the shape of your hands, the radius can be either from a full quarter round to anything you want. The important thing is to have some guidelines. And I'm just going to mark a line at 3/16. And I'm going to do that on all four sides. All these lines are really going to do is just help us with our symmetry. It's going to help us keep whatever radius we're doing. It's going to give us visual cues that we can follow to try and keep that radius consistent all the way down. I'm going to start with the corners, going from the flat and working this way to get those corners knocked off. And the way I visualize it is I'm taking off a corner, and then I'm taking off a corner, and as I'm rocking the file across, all I'm trying to do is take out each corner, and if you take off all the corners, it's round. From time to time, take a minute, stop, and if you sight back to front to back, either way, but you will be able to see if you're high or low or how consistent your curve is. Symmetry is going to be one of the hardest things for people to get. It's the hardest thing to do by hand. Doing something once is easy. Doing it the same way 4 times is where it starts to get difficult. And once you've got the radius of where you want it, or at least pretty close, you're just going to repeat that process on all 4 corners. Once you've got the corners pretty consistent, rolled over a little bit, now it becomes a matter of feel. So hold it in your hand, just kind of squeeze really tightly, and if it feels like there's a spot that's biting you, that's pointing in, round that off a little bit more. So on me, it's right there, so I'm going to come back and take that down a little bit, and then it's just a matter of sanding. Back here on the butt, you don't need a big soft curve, but you do want to kind of round these corners off, because if you've got hard corners, especially with a wood handle, they're prone to chip really badly. So if you just round those off a little bit, it'll keep the handle looking nice. Once the handle starts to feel good, then we're going to start looking. We're going to check our symmetry at the back and at the front. And if the symmetry looks good, then we'll start on the sandpaper. All right, for the sanding, we're going to go back to 80 grit. if we've left some file marks in the spine, we're going to work nice and flat, get those file marks out. And then once that's done, we're going to start rocking back and forth because we want to keep that round shape that we've put into it. Now, especially with that 80 grit sandpaper, you can change the shape that you would put in with the file. So every so often, stop, check and make sure everything's still the shape you want. Now we're going to need to get the flats of this, and to do that, you're going to put the knife in edge to spine. Apart from risking the edge, you want to be really careful because if you press too hard on the handle, the blade's going to pop out. So we're going to be very careful. We're going to make sure that the blade is perfectly level. We're going to be careful of our edge. We're going to make it snug. You'll see our pencil marks are gone. We've got a couple of little slow spots. A couple of things to be aware of. As you go past the edge of your handle, you want to try to keep your sanded block flat. A lot of people, they'll put pressure on one edge or the other, and the sanding block will come down and roll over. On this knife, it's pretty simple. It's not too big a deal, but on some of your other knives, you'll get either a very badly rolled front and back edge, or even worse, you'll hit the blade. The other thing people tend to do is, because they're so worried about rolling over, they'll stop short. So when you think you're finished, take a minute and closely look at either end and make sure there's no marring or nasty scratches or any of that sort of thing. And now we're going to do same techniques, but we're going to progress all the way up through 400 to 600. Especially on oak, anything sanding after 600 is really, it's wasted effort unless you're putting some sort of varnish or that sort of thing on it. And then you're getting such a smooth finish that it's not really practical for a handle. All right, I've taken the handle out to about a 600 grit. It's nice and silky. I'm really pleased with the shape. So now we get the final decision of how we want to finish this.
So there you have it. Here is the finished Condor Woodlaw that we made. It shows you with just a little bit of time and some tools that you may already have, you can build a knife that you can be proud of. Now, we did actually film a second half of this video where we introduced some affordable power tools, some popular kind of beginner knife making equipment, including a 1x30 belt sander. Depending on how well this video does, and if you folks are interested in it, let us know in the comments if you are. Maybe we'll put that out. We'll show you a few more complicated handle shaping as well, as we did with this Condor bush lore, as you can see. But a big, big thank you to our very good friend, Dan Eastland of Dogwood Custom Knives. Thanks for letting us tie up your shop for a day. It was a lot of fun, though. We all had a blast, even Thomas back there. Yay. If you're interested in any of Dan's custom work, we'll leave a link to our Dogwood Custom Knives page on the website. You can see what we've got in stock right now. You can pick up any of these knife blanks from our site as well. We'll leave a link to these Condors, and I think we have a section actually of all our knife blanks. We'll link that down below as well. Leave your questions in the comments, folks. This is a frequently asked question, or at least a question and answer type of video. If you've got a question you think it is worthy of inclusion in a future episode, drop them in the comments below, and we'll be back to our regular format for our Knife AQ videos in the next week. If you're picking any of these things up from KnifeCenter, don't forget about our long-running Knife Rewards program while you're over there, so you can earn some free money to spend on your future knives when you pick up one today. I'm David C. Anderson from the KnifeCenter. That's still Thomas behind the camera, and we're signing off. See you next time.